Hello everyone, my name is Abby and I'm the Young Adult Assistant at the Twin Lakes Library System and I use she, her pronouns. So today for Must Read Monday, I wanted to recommend some hard-hitting contemporary novels. So hard-hitting contemporary novels are usually novels that are in a contemporary or real setting that address important topics and themes and things that happen in the real world, and they're a little more intense of a read, but they make you think. So a lot of them address themes of grief, themes of abuse, themes of racism and discrimination, LGBT community conversations are a lot of themes that come into hard-hitting contemporary novels. And these books are usually some of my favorites because they really make me think, and they really grasp me in a way that a lot of other books don't do. I think it's because they deal with real themes, and I think that's really important to address. And I think that the young adult genre is sometimes not taken really seriously because it follows a teenage audience or character usually, but they have a lot of really important things to say and a lot of really good lessons to teach. So I'm going to be talking about 3 books today. All of these books you can get put on hold in our physical collection at the library that you can use through the drive-thru. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first book I have to recommend is Every Exquisite Thing by Matthew Quick. And this doesn't have a Common Sense Media age recommendation. I would say probably 14 or 15 is a good age to read this book. I read this book when I was a senior in high school, which was over 3 years ago. But I still remember it very vividly, and it's really stuck with me throughout all these years. So this book is about Nanette O'Hare. She goes by Nan as her nickname, and she's kind of the quintessential, like, popular, smart, pretty, talented girl. She plays soccer, and she's been getting a lot of offers for scholarships for it because she's so good at it, and she's a straight A student. And she's the most ideal daughter and student that you'd ever want, and she has so many options and opportunities that are there for her. Her whole life is set, basically. She has nothing to worry about, essentially. But Annette doesn't really want that for her life. That's not really what she wants. Annette's not really sure what she wants. And then one day a teacher gives her a book called The Bubblegum Reaper, and she reads it, and it kind of sparks an inner rebellion for Nanette, and she realizes that this isn't what she wants, and she's not content just to live her life the way that other people have told her to live her life. And so she starts doing all these things that she wants to do, and starts, being a little wild and going about completely the opposite of who she's always been. And then she sort of starts to realize that you can't just do that, and that there are consequences to those decisions, and that it's not going to work out the way you think it does. So that's all I'm going to say. I think it's probably better to go into this book a little blind, but it's a very powerful book. So why I loved it. I think that this book is incredibly relatable. When you're in high school or when you're young, a lot of people have a lot of expectations of you, and they want you to do a certain thing, and everyone has a different plan for your life, and you're not really necessarily sure if that's what you want to do. A lot of people don't know what they want to do at 17, which is kind of when they ask you to make a decision about that, which is intense. I sure didn't know what I wanted to do at 17. So I think it was relatable to read that and see a character who, yes, there are a lot of things set up for them, but maybe that's not what she wants in her life, and I think that's something that a lot of teenagers can relate to. I think that this book also has important conversations about mental health. So that's a big theme in this book, mental health and therapy. A positive conversation about mental health and therapy, because sometimes that's not portrayed super positively. I think that YA is doing a really good job at being a really inclusive space, and addressing important themes of mental health through a wide variety of different diagnoses, and for the most part, most of them are well researched and are very respectful, so it's nice to see, and I think this book is one of them. I think they do a really good job talking about mental health in an appropriate and responsible way. So, and then the idea of growth. So a lot of people change and shift in this book, Nanette being one of them, and it's just nice to see her, maybe not necessarily mature or like completely change, but she sort of starts to understand who she is a little bit better. She was a little unsure of herself, and I think that the setting of the book and what happens in the book allows her to grow and figure out who she might be and who she could become. So I really liked that. It also addressed a lot of other important themes, such as privilege and isolation, and, tackles those in a very respectful and responsible way, and kind of makes them more complex and addresses them in a way that's respectful and good. And then I just think it has really beautiful writing. All the books that I'm recommending today, I think, have beautiful writing, which leads me into my next book, which is, and this is an author I've never talked about before, Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. Big shock, I'm talking about Elizabeth Acevedo. In case you couldn't tell, she's one of my favorite authors of all time. This is her newest released book. She released it this year. This is the first book I actually read physically by her. I usually do the audiobooks, but I got this and there was no audiobook out yet, and I was like, I'm not waiting, so I'm gonna read it. And I'm not mad that I did, because it was incredible. I think it's actually my favorite book by her so far, which is hard to top the Poet X, because I think that book was incredible. But anyways, so Common Sense Media recommends this book for ages 14 and up. And this book follows two sisters, and Camino, she lives in the Dominican Republic, and her father visits her every summer, and Yahara, I think is how you say her name, lives in New York, and they do not know each other exist. But then one day they find out that their father has died in a plane crash on the way to see Camino in the Dominican Republic, and so they are both trying to cope with this and grieve over this, and then they start realizing that there are a lot of secrets that their father had, them being one of them from each other, that they didn't know about, and they sort of have to cope with that and, deal with their life drastically changing. So that's all I'm going to say. It's a pretty short summary for the book, but it's better, again, kind of going into it blind, I think. So why I loved it. This book has such a really strong portrayal of how people cope with grief and pain, and how it addresses tragedy, because, a lot of things happen in this world that are very tragic and sad, and we sort of, people just sort of move on after a little bit, but there are people who are stuck dealing with it because they were directly affected by it, and they sort of have to cope with it while the rest of the world sort of moves on. And that's basically what these two girls have to do, and it's really hard to read, but it's important because it just sort of makes you think that that is a reality that some people have to face in their life. It's a reality a lot of people have to face in their life. This book was actually, she talks about it in the back, but it's sort of based off of this plane crash I believe happened. Oh goodness, let me see. She talked about it in the very back. Let me see. There's a plane crash that had, yes, so it says, when I was 13 years old, 2 months and 1 day after September 11th, 2001, flight AA587 crashed to the ground in Queens, New York. It was on its way to Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. 260 people plus 5 people on the ground died. More than 90% of the passengers were of Dominican descent. Many were returning home. It was completely rocked. The New York Dominican community is the second deadliest aviation crash in the United States history. So that happened, and there wasn't a lot of media coverage over it, and I think that's partially what inspired her to write this and sort of address the themes that she does, which is tragedy happens, and sometimes people just don't talk about it or acknowledge it, so she wanted to write this, I think, partially as a response to that sort of idea, and she does it beautifully, which is the next thing that I love about it. The writing, it's in verse, like Poet X, With a Fire on High was just like your traditional sort of novel, which was done in prose, but this is done in verse. It's very beautiful. Elizabeth Acevedo is a very talented poet, and she is able to convey a really compelling narrative through verse. It never suffers. You never feel like it's confusing. It's very well written. The next thing that I really love is the relationships that develop regarding this story. So again, they don't know each other exists at the beginning of this book, and basically sort of through the realization of what's happening with their father, sort of start to figure out all these secrets, and, you know, families sort of develop all these relationships, and it's a really beautiful development. I mean, it's very realistic. It's not like everything's like instantly, oh, we're best friends. It's very realistic. It's very, you know, it portrays how they would really feel in that situation, I think. It doesn't make it easy, it makes it real, and I think it's really well done. It addresses sort of the different lives that people can live, and how we all come from very different sort of, you know, privileges and economic well-being and, you know, different places we live. It addresses those and just talks about it and sort of brings awareness to, like, maybe thinking about how, you know, lucky some people are and how some people are not as lucky in certain areas of their life, and just brings awareness to that and talks about it and doesn't brush over it. And then the last thing, this is a smaller part of the book, but there is LGBT representation. One of the main characters is on the LGBT spectrum, which I think is great. I just love to see that being casually thrown in there. I think it's important because that's a reality of the world, and I love seeing it, and I love seeing how Elizabeth Acevedo wrote the relationship. I thought it was very beautiful and great. Okay, and then my last book that I'm going to be recommending, and this is my favorite book of all time, and this is I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson. I kid you not, this is my favorite book of all time. This is the best, like, my favorite thing I've ever read. I've read so many books in my life, and this one takes the top spot. And I've been waiting for the opportunity to recommend it, and I felt like this was finally the time. So this is also recommended for ages 14 and up, and the plot of this book, it focuses around two siblings, and it's Noah and his sister Jude. And when they're young, Noah and Jude are very close with each other, and they're best friends, basically. They're completely inseparable. And Noah is really artistic, and he sort of starts to develop a crush on a new boy who's moved into town. And Jude, you know, she's very rebellious and, you know, loves action and being out there. But then, years later, the other narration of this book kind of jumps in time. They aren't speaking to each other anymore. Something happened that changed them both. And it's just drastically shifted the whole relationship and their personalities. And then Jude meets a boy who is very interesting and intriguing to her, and she gets a new mentor for her art, and sort of just developing on that. So, the narration style goes that Noah tells, I think they're 13, in the early years, and then when Jude talks, they're 16, and their narrations shift, but so does the time. So that's really cool. And it's sort of just about them, like, sort of establishing, like, their relationship and what happened and how if they become close again. So what I love about this book, besides everything, the writing is incredible. It's so beautiful. It's very metaphorical and lyrical and artistic, and some people don't like that kind of writing. I, for one, love it. I think it's great. If you don't like that kind of writing, you're probably not going to like this book, but I think the writing is one of the strong parts about this book. I think it's beautifully done. I think she does a lot of really good, like, metaphors and almost kind of like magical realism, but it works so well with this book, with the emphasis on art that it has. Noah, like, has these paintings that he makes, and they, like, are all called these really cool things. It's just really cool. I really like seeing. The characters. So the characters are very realistic, and they are deeply flawed. They do terrible things in this book. Noah and Jude do terrible things in this book. They, like, at some points in the book, you're gonna hate one of them. At both times in the book, like, you're never gonna fully... There's gonna be a time where you hate Jude, and there's gonna be a time where you hate Noah. You love them anyways, but, like, they do some bad things to each other in this book, and it's surprising because sometimes I feel like books don't like to make their characters like as flawed as these two are, but they are definitely flawed characters, but they also develop so beautifully. It's so great to see them grow and change as the story goes and talks about stuff. The next thing is the conversation about familial relationships. So again, these two are siblings, and I have siblings, and I can say that while it is, obviously, we've never had that sort of relationship, but there are definitely things that, like, I think Jandy Nelson picks up in that a lot of people with siblings will connect with, things that make you upset that your siblings do, but then you're totally fine the next second. That's basically me, like, how a lot of siblings are, but also sort of the relationship people have with their parents, and you know, how parents present themselves to their children and how children receive that and how that image sort of is changed over time. And I think that that is really well written and realistically written. The next thing, the passion for art in this book is if you like art, you will deeply appreciate this book and the characters in it, because they are all obsessed with art. That's like one of the main focal points of this. And I'm not really like not artsy, I can't draw, but I appreciate how much they all love it, and I think it's really well, and I think it connects really well with the writing, because the writing is very artistic, and so is the emphasis on art. How this book addresses themes of grief is really important, I think. I think it talks about the different types of coping mechanisms people have for grief, and I think that's important, and I definitely think that Jandy Nelson does a really good job always when addressing themes of grief. She has another book called The Sky is Everywhere, which is also incredible and beautiful, and I'm obsessed with it, but it's also kind of the story of grief, and she always does a really good job tackling those themes in her books. The next thing I like about it is the way that it presents the world. It just makes you think about the world in such a different way than you originally do. Just kind of going through on an everyday basis, I just think about the world a lot more introspectively when I read this book. And then the last thing is I think it really understands what it's like to be a teenager. I think all of these books really do a good job of this. I'm just particularly highlighting this one because, again, I read this when I was in high school. I think it was my junior year. I made everyone I know read this book, and they have all loved it, so you have to trust me on this. But I read it my junior year of high school, and I think it really, you know, like, sort of understands how confusing and isolating and sometimes painful being a teenager can be, but also, you know, the good moments and the magical moments and the sort of learning and growing moments. And I think it encompasses all of those mixed feelings and does a really good job at articulating that through the characters. And then this book also has LGBTQ rep, which I think is, again, great. I love seeing it. I always want to see it in books. But Noah is gay, and that's not a spoiler. That's in the summary on the side of the book you can see. But yeah, definitely check out any of these books. I think they're all great. And I will see you again later. Bye.